Blog Talk Radio.
It seems we have a problem. I would like to introduce Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Investigations team.
Welcome to another edition of Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Radio. I have the whole panel on the line with me today, Brent, Tim, Nick, myself. We're going to be talking to Harry Drew. He is an expert on a UFO crash from Kingman, Arizona. And I guess we're going to call Harry right now and get the show started. Should be calling.
Harry Drew.
Hi,
hello.
Harry.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I'm Jeremy, and then I have a couple of my co-hosts on right now. Do you guys want to introduce yourself to Harry?
Yeah, you're a little crackly. I guess that's okay, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say,
everything all right?
I have Tim, Nick, and Brent, my co-hosts.
Say that again.
Oh, I have Tim, Nick, and Brent. They're my co-hosts.
Okay.
And
yes. Hi there. How much time are we on air for?
An hour.
Okay, good enough. That tells me how fast I have to run. Are you on?
Can you describe a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with the case?
Yes, easily. I live at Kingman, Arizona. I am a former museum director and curator of history, anthropology, and archaeology, cultural resource specialist. I was a newspaper columnist. I've been an author for 40 years, and I live here, and I've heard about the Kingman UFO crash story, and I've read things on the internet off and on, and being a historian, I noticed right away there were some serious inconsistencies about what was being said. And so I decided one day, 6 years ago, that, in fact, this month, that I was going to do some investigation on my own to find out, was there or was there not a UFO crash at Kingman in May of 1953. So I went ahead and did that using the normal protocols that are a prerequisite for professional historians. So when I find something, I can prove it. If I find something, it will lead generally to something else. Are you there?
Yes.
And so I proceeded with that. So it's like, there's a specific type of methodology to actual investigative research. And there is a tremendous amount of bad information out there by people claiming to be investigators, pretending to be, I call them exaggerators, pretending to be researchers, and they're the ones that all of us, the real historians, cringe at, because they're the same people. It's worse now than ever because of the internet, but they're the same people that 200 or 300 years ago, they wrote down something, they copied from something that somebody else said that was wrong, and they put a little twist on it to try to make it theirs. And several hundred years later, the story is completely inaccurate and, involves people that never existed or places that weren't involved and so on and so forth. So I began at the beginning. I began to research in research libraries. I went to museums. I wanted to see whatever government documents I could get my hands on. This isn't something that, all of this stuff, everything involving unidentified flying objects that we consider to be extraterrestrial in origin is classified top secret. And it isn't something that is just put out there in circulars that you can pick up at a local market, about what the government's doing. They just have never done that, ever. And I'm not saying it never showed up in some market. I'm just saying the government didn't deliberately go out and start posting it, because the government makes mistakes. And for all of the purists out there listening to this, or will listen to this, the very idea that the military and the government would never violate security protocols and leave anything or put something out or make a mistake is silly. I'm a former U.S. Army guy, and I can tell you that's not true from what I saw, but I can tell you as a historian, one of the places that we go to, if we can find the basic area where there was a fort or a settlement or a battle or all kinds of things, we go look for the dump, because everything about the occupation, even temporary occupation of an area, is in that dump, including stuff that was new at the time or just excess, and they didn't want to carry it. The military has this thing that has gone on for centuries about if they're not using it, instead of putting it away and pull it out later, they take it out in a pile and they set it on fire, and they just destroy it. And that's actually something that happened in part of the Kingman story. There's one of the best exaggerator stories I'll tell you in a few minutes, but why don't we jump over to telling your audience out there, the listeners in this case, a little bit about what in the world I'm talking about. The Kingman UFO crash. The original crash story reaches back in time to when 40 specialists and scientists were said to have been brought together in Phoenix, Arizona. It was late in the afternoon on May 21, 1953. They boarded a military bus and were driven out, basically into the night, with the windows of this bus taped out, so it was all blacked out, they couldn't see out, and the whole thing was top secret, and they went out to inspect a UFO near Kingman, Arizona. Now that's kind of like an encapsulated version. 1953. Nobody knew about this until 1973 as far as it getting out to the public. Okay. There were people in Kingman, the old-timers. They knew about it. They saw these things happening. Over a 7-day period, if we have the time, I will tell you about one, not an unidentified flying object. On the 18th of May, one flying saucer made a forced landing. The crew of that saucer were 4-member crew, were uninjured. That means they are alive. I've told the story before and been quoted in, like the Examiners, that all the survivors died, and they didn't. They lived. And the craft was without any harm, not even scratch. Well, how do I know that? There was a newspaper article in the Middlesex News in Massachusetts in 1973, April 23rd, about a young boy, 15 years old, writing a UFO book, and he happened to mention a man by the name of Arthur Stansel. He's real. He really existed. He was sent from Wright-Patterson after being 12 years there to the Nevada Frenchman Flat test area to be part of the Operation Upshot Knothole, which was the atomic bomb blast tests, which were happening several a month, sometimes more than one a week. And he was advised by the project director one day that he was to report to Indian Springs Air Force Base in Nevada to be flown on a secret mission. He didn't even know where he was going. It ended up he went to Phoenix. He was on this bus I just told you about. The bus driver's name is Mike. The bus was a Model 3301 U.S. military bus. 840 of them were made in 1951 and 52. I can tell you the weather and the wind speed, and there was a quarter moon out the night they arrived. I really have done research not only in documentation, but I've been out in the field, and that's all right. So there's 4 crew members survived. While they're trying to deal with the fact there is no military presence in Old Town Kingman, Arizona. Now, everyone, please picture with me for a moment. If you've ever seen the old TV series, Mayberry, USA. That's Kingman, Arizona, 1953. Without Opie, down at the pond, because there is no pond. It's desert and some mountain area. And the people didn't have any military there since August of 1945. It was an Army Air Force base at Kingman, which later became the port of entry for Mojave County, M-O-H-A-V-E, Mojave County, Arizona, and became a civilian airport within a year of that. So 1947, no military after August of 1945. I'm repeating that because I'm going to tell you about an exaggerator story. Anyway, 4 days later, another UFO, this one is a UFO, technically not, but I'm going to let it go at that for the moment. And it was seen by 15 people, losing altitude, and there was some type of a stabilization problem with the platform, just like the other one that was forced down and landed. The Air Force didn't understand any of that. They were actually causing it because the Air Force had 3 radars that they were experimenting with because of the Cold War, and they were overdriving them, overpowering them as much as 24 times their rated power to try to get an idea if they could, how far they could see while the new radar, which came in 1955, was finally ready to be introduced because the Russians had the atomic bomb and they were building a long-range bomber called the Badger. And so we were worried they might try to do a sneak attack over the pole or something. So radar then was 25-mile range. They were trying to achieve 150 miles. That is not a 6-time difference. It's mathematically, the geometry goes up and it comes out 24 times the rated power. It was short pulse microwave radiation. Every pulse that went out was a different frequency. They had no way to control it. And they had 3 of them set up on a triangle. and it was right in the flight path that the UFOs regularly flew. And you know what? They still do, because they're going to and from a base. They still use it. We still see UFOs here. But all of this was it's absolutely taboo for the old timers here to tell any of this to the general public. And there's certainly more. And the ones that have shared things with me, I cannot even name. But that's all right, because in a DVD that I have just completed called Hidden in Plain Sight, the Kingman UFO crashes have been found. It's absolutely accurate. I have interviews with 3 of the principal people involved in this, who one was a recovery member with the Air Force who came with the recovery team, and to help take out the first one, take out the second one, which I was mentioning 4 days later, seemed to lose control. It headed for what would be like a hard landing or something on the desert floor. And there was a rocky butte in the way, and it ricocheted right off almost the top of the butte, which caused, according to my engineer, who is also the one who helped and worked with James Cameron for the Mariana Trench, the craft went 0.21 miles and landed on the other side of a reservoir called F-O-O, tank. That word was being used in Arizona before Foo Fighters were ever even thought about. It's an old phrase for a dirt dam holding water back to water cattle and wildlife. This one was capable of watering about 200 head of cattle. It overshot that, but hitting the rocky butte pretty much tore the bottom of the craft out. Two of the crew were injured, taken to Nellis Air Force Base. They died of their injuries. The other 2 joined the first 4 who had been promptly and immediately taken to Groom Lake, which had been an Army Air Corps base handed off to Edwards Air Force Base in 1951, and to all those that say, well, nothing could have happened before 55, because that's when they were budgeted at Groom Lake. Think of Groom Lake as Area 51. And it was being developed rapidly because Edwards we all know about what are called black budgets. Edwards had money to do the development. It was an Air Force base with hangars and runways, and all these things were already there, through 45 era. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't out of reason that they wouldn't spend some money. And it became actually, according to a full bird colonel that I interviewed, and I have on film, it became a place for down discs. That was its original function. Discs meaning UFOs, flying something, saucers, or whatever the configuration might be. They were learning about all this. They meaning the Air Force, they had no control of anything. That was 4 days later. That crash here locally is known as the Red Lake Foo Tank crash. Red Lake, Mojave County, Arizona, not Red Lake, New Mexico. Everybody gets that confused. 2 days later, almost everybody in Old Town, there's 3,500 people living in Old Town Kingman, which is much smaller, believe me, than it is today. And they watched a disc come down and hit the north face of the Wallapai Mountain, which is 8,266 feet high, right in the broad daylight, and it slammed into the mountain and promptly set the forest on fire. So you had a problem with a forest fire. 2 of the crew of that craft died. Their disposition, along with the 2 from Nellis, was they were later packed here in Arizona, and they were brought together and packed in dry ice, and they were shipped to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Those are the ones, if you were to read Richard Hall's book about page 78, those 4 aliens are from Kingman in 2 different crafts. The other 2 survivors from the crash and the fire on the Wallapai were apprehended and arrested because they were thought to have been involved somehow in arson. And a newspaper reporter at the time, and you have to imagine with me, if you will, a guy with a crumpled white shirt, some tweed pants with cuffs, pardon me, and a pencil over his ear. See these two guys go by with a Forest Service worker and some aides to get the people down the hill to get them to the sheriff's office, and he writes down the terminology that's later right on the front page of the Kingman Daily Miner newspaper, writes down two strange-looking men. And now that brings me to, what did the crew members look like? And according to a member of the Air Force recovery team that I interviewed about a year and a half before he died, and I have that on film, it's in my DVD, and he said, almost breathlessly still, they were human. He was awestruck. 1953, War of the Worlds, George Powell production, and the creature in that, the Martian, was like squat, short, one eye, and had suckers on its finger. That's what everybody expected, pretty much. And these crew members were basically in jumpsuits. That'd be like a one-piece coverall. They didn't have like Star Trek blazers and emblems and mics sewn into the cloth and all of these things. They were just plain, ordinary-looking outer garments. They were approximately 5 feet in height, light blondish sandy blonde kind of hair. Their faces were much like ours, eyes slightly set apart more than ours, but you do see that in the human population, and I can mention why in a few minutes. And chins that narrowed down more like a Valentine heart than we are used to seeing. Other than that, they looked pretty much like we did, and what he meant was humanoid. But it was like something they had to get over with. But after a short delay at the site, because of a complication with that landed UFO, they got him out of there. These other two that I mentioned here were taken to the sheriff's office in what was and is the 1910 Mojave County Courthouse, and the sheriff's office was located in the basement below grade. That means below the level of the outside ground. There are no windows, doors, or entry forms, holes, or anything on that side in the basement area of the building. It is all poured, the entire building, all of it, is poured in place, steel reinforced concrete. Then in the sheriff's office, there were two doors they had to pass through lock with 4 deputies inside and a window that they would open and conduct business. Inside of that were 2 rooms, and those 2 rooms were considered detention rooms. Later, they were more appropriately named interrogation rooms. Now, I know all about that because of research, and I had never seen these things because that entire area of the Mojave County Courthouse today and for the past 3 decades has been off limits to the public because the court conducts business down there, you know, in regard to cases. And so it's county court employees only. And I went and told my story without the UFO part because that can get you thrown out. You know what I'm talking about. And I talked to the head of security from Mojave County Court, and I described the interior of the building down to a oak bench that the Forest Service worker sat on while the deputy went to get the sheriff because he wasn't in. This is Old Town Kingman, 1953, you know, no television, nothing. They had no communication. They didn't even know about the Roswell crash, not a word. That's not unusual. News didn't travel very far back then. So while they're getting them, the 2 strange-looking men had been locked in one of these rooms. And so the head of security took me there. He not only allowed me to see these things, it was exactly as my documentation had indicated to me, and he allowed me to photograph it all, which I also include in the thing I have put together called Hidden Approach. And I'll tell you, Hidden Approach is like a pre-look at what is called Terminal Approach, which is being viewed for some big screen stuff, and those discussions come next, beginning in January. What I also had to say is that after all of this work, and after all of the interviews that I've done, I found, and I'll repeat that so everybody understands, I found the landing site exactly as the Air Force left it in May 1953, including physical evidence, and a lot of it. All right? And that has been surveyed and photographed. I've been mainly doing that, and the Red Lake crash site I have found, and I've spent a tremendous amount of time doing 6-camera overflights. The assisting engineer that I had, I mentioned what he was involved with about 8 months ago now, the Mariana Trench Dive with James Cameron, assisted me on some of that so that I could map everything. I wanted photographs at 50 feet off the ground, 100 feet and 300 feet, and not depend on trying to look at stuff from a satellite view that's rather restrictive on the internet. And I can read ground terrain. I've used that for years in finding ancient sites. And I was up against the same thing in 60 years of vegetation growth and other considerations. And so I actually have both sites. I have not allowed anyone to see the landing site, with the exception of the engineer and Dr. Joan Hangarter, who was assisting me part of this year, who I might also give credit to in doing some research. On this day, May 21, where the bus came with the 40 scientists and specialists to examine the craft, each taken by an MP to the very specific area of their expertise. They weren't allowed to wander around, climb all over it. It's the pitch dark with well, it's almost pitch dark. There's a quarter moon. 2 glaring spotlights on this buffed out, kind of a buffed aluminum color of the craft. And the lights were so bright you were unable to see where you were. You couldn't see out beyond into the darkness because of the brilliance. And these scientists got a chance to examine something and were told it was a super secret U.S. Air Force experimental aircraft. And they bought that at first. I mean, they actually pretty much believed the story. And by then, of course, on the 21st of May, in the night, the aliens were long gone. They were gone. The craft came down the 18th in the afternoon. They were gone, taken out of there. And they were taken to Groom Lake. So you had 4, and you had 2 from the Red Lake crash that survived, and they survived, that means alive, taken to Groom Lake, and 2 that are locked up in a highly secure room that no way out except through that door, and then you'd have to be able to open up 2 other doors that use keys to get in and out of. The sheriff arrives, the Forest Service worker explains to him what's going on. The sheriff tells the deputy to open the door, and now I'm going to ask you a question. If you've been able to follow me going as fast as I have, they open up the door, and the sheriff steps in. What do you think happened? What do you think they found?
I'm not really sure. I was going to say,
right.
What do you think, Nick?
There was nobody there.
Yeah, we're here.
Oh, yeah.
And you want to know something really interesting? That was on the front page of the newspaper.
Oh, wow.
And I'll tell you what, and not one, and what was really bizarre, because this will be in like Terminal Approach, okay, the Kingman UFO crashes movie. What was really interesting was the sheriff didn't do a thing. He didn't say, seal the building, close off the town, which is an easy thing. In 1953, Kingman, Arizona, there was 1 road in and out there were 2 roads going in and out of Kingman, period. You know, so some of these other stories, if I have a chance to mention, you're going to find out are just complete baloney that are being put on the internet, okay? And it's in books and in DVDs. The stuff is just not true, and it isn't true because it can be. When things aren't there, like a highway, you have to finally say, okay, this person may be exaggerating, and that's why I call them exaggerators. But Dr. Hangarter found something very interesting. At 10 o'clock on the morning of the 21st, that's the day the bus came, brought the scientists in the night, and they went up and they looked at the craft, okay? They examined it. Then the craft was removed. They took it out of what is called in situ, and then they moved it, and by then they had brought in equipment from Camp Irwin, which had gone to armor, so they had like an M25 tank transporter and some other heavy lift equipment from the Army base over by Barstow, and medical people from Nellis, and there was like Corps of Engineers, Army, waiting above Hoover Dam because that's how they got it across the Colorado. And they took it up Stockton Hill Road, onto Pierce Ferry Road, out across the desert, right about a mile on the upper part of 93, up behind the dam, and onto the thing, and across the river, and on the way to Groom Lake, straight shot. That's how they did that. And you can look at road structures deserted as far back as 1918 by satellite right now. It's perfectly clear because there's so little erosion. So Dr. Hangarter found that 5 minutes flight time away, 3 men were on the ground looking at a place to hold a fishing derby for kids. They had no idea the Air Force had a UFO. Okay, and the Air Force had no idea there were 3 guys out wandering around in the desert and woods and stuff. And these 3 men looked up, and there were 8 UFOs. 1 on each side of 6 were parked and hovering, and the other 6 were doing what are described on the front page of the Prescott, Arizona newspaper as dogfight maneuvers. 2 of the witnesses who watched this for over an hour were military pilots. 1 was currently at that time contracted to train military pilots at 3 Air Force bases in Arizona. At that very moment, they had no idea why they were seeing what they were seeing. And if the people, the Air Force recovery team with the craft before the scientists showed up knew, they would have probably freaked, because the dogfights is like in preparatory to do what? You're going to take your craft back. Yeah. And they were only 5 minutes flight time away. And there they were. And so I thought that was a rather remarkable find. And yeah, it's right on the front page. So anyway, the 2 disappeared, and there was a similar incident 3 years before that in 1950 that I'll cover more in Terminal Approach, and there were 5 in a whole craft, and they disappeared right in front of everybody. And that was, in fact, documented. And you're talking to a former museum director and curator who isn't delusional. I've seen and come across things most of my career, and I dare not ever have spoken about it because it would affect your credibility and your career to go out and talk about UFOs and extraterrestrials. But I'll tell you something interesting. I've had lots of visits here since I've gone to the main site. Radiation level where the craft was sitting on the ground, slightly to tilt, wasn't a crash landing. It settled because of I've already done what are called porosity tests, because the soil there, the sand is undermined by water because they were in a drain field. And the scientist who was examining and trying to determine its rate of fall and impact speed, which was Arthur Stansel, the guy mentioned in that newspaper in the Middlesex News in Massachusetts in 1973, and interviewed by Raymond Fowler, who was a very noted NICAP investigator back then, couldn't understand, because he did bomb blast effect analysis on a nuclear bomb blast. They'd build little towns and blow up the town and see what survived and how forests reacted and vehicles could withstand getting hit by the blast force or the fireball or whatever. And he couldn't understand why he was getting the numbers he had, and he was basing everything on the fact that he was still at Frenchman Flat where the ground was like concrete. And what happened is that the ground was wet underneath about 4 inches below the surface. I've already done porosity tests in all seasons for the past year, and then the radiation test, which was 5 times normal background radiation, right where it's at. And if you walk away 60 to 100 feet, you're back to normal range. And yeah, it could possibly be a natural phenomenon, maybe, but the coincidence is pretty high when it's right smack where it was parked. And the other thing is there's a landmark that was a clue given to me by a recovery team member. I had 448 square miles to search, and it was just impossible, and it was narrowed down to 20. And when I got the clue, there was a natural rock formation right where the bus turned off. And knowing that there were only 2 roads in and out of here, that gave me some kind of a target to acquire. And when I found it, I looked out my Wrangler Jeep window, and I was looking right at the field kitchen where the Air Force had set up to feed the guys that were working on all this. And they left all kinds of things there, and there's a bivouac area and the whole thing. And so I had somebody say, well, that doesn't prove that there was a UFO there. Well, this is in the middle of nowhere, so it's highly unlikely that anyone would go. It's a very inconvenient spot to be camped for the military, and I've done that in the Army. But the other thing is there are 3 other witnesses with the recovery team witness who have a distinction above 12 others and 15 others on different days for different downings. And those distinctions are they actually put their hand on the craft. They touched the craft. They walked, and 2 of them were physicists. 2 of them had engineering degrees. The Air Force man was an Air Force man. You know, later became a full bird colonel and a test pilot. And I have all the documentation on this. So the importance here is that people miss. And I just came back from speaking at the Conscious Life Expo at LAX Hilton in Los Angeles, and I've spoken at the Bay Area UFO Con in September. I was the guest speaker invited by the National MUFON to speak at the International MUFON Symposium to make this a world announcement, because I have the craft sites. They're real. And what's so important about the landing and the Kingman craft? Here it is. Without that craft, there is no Area 51 story, period. Because that's the craft they took there and did the reverse engineering with.
That's quite interesting.
How's that? Good enough?
I'd like to say, I'd like to go back to the topic of methodology for a second, and I'd like to just say, what was the first step you took in trying to investigate this crash? Did you talk to eyewitnesses? Did you go through newspapers? Where did you take
my first step was to disregard the garbage on the internet. Like a story about an Air Force man in the tower one night in they said May 20, the fellow that's got a blog, who's got books, he's a Saturday guest on Coast to Coast, okay? It's like the pinnacle. And he said, you know, he's been chasing this down. And first he said it did happen, then he said it didn't happen, then he said it did happen in his book, then it came out in his blog and said absolutely didn't happen, okay? And so he couldn't even make up his mind. But what he did say was an Air Force man who was allegedly later died while he was in Vietnam before he could send a letter to his wife about what happened, was that he was at the tower at the Kingman Air Base, and he saw on the radar that this UFO went by, and he looked out the window in the dark and he saw the flash of light as it crashed. Okay. There was no tower equipment. It was destroyed in July of 1945 by the military. Everything taken out, including the scope and the tower. It was gutted out, and the whole thing was deserted by the next month in August. And we're talking about this airman was in a tower that had been closed for 8 years and saw something crash at night that came down in the day. Okay, so there's a problem, and but this is the stuff that's been written. So, all right, I discounted the internet. I went to a research library. I checked letters from the United States Air Force. Even the Air Force asked internally in the Pentagon, this is an inter-Pentagon communication within the Air Force. Do you suppose our radar is responsible somehow for knocking down these UFOs? That was a question. They had no idea. Does that help at all? Yeah, the methodology, and then I went to a museum. You know, I mean, the next step. Yeah.
So in other words, we have a bunch of people out there who are more or less maybe armchair investigators that are just concocting these stories in order to maybe just get attention into themselves?
Yeah. Say the front of that again. Did you say we have?
Yeah, we have like the paranormal investigating community, if I may use that term, has people that just spins. They're story spinners. That's all they are. They're not really investigators at all.
Yeah. I look at them as most of them. I look at as enthusiasts. Okay. And I don't mean any ill will to anybody. You know, I was just handed a thing yesterday, and it's about somebody wrote a book and is talking about claiming the Roswell crash. By the way, they're still looking for proof that Roswell, that there was a crash, and now they're investigating. Now they're doing interviews with second or third-hand witnesses because there are no living witnesses. You see? And I have interviews with living witnesses, people that were participants in this, and I do have one that is with the friend of a physicist who died before I could interview him. And so it's just how it goes. But talking to the real people, looking at let's see, Raymond Fowler did a 65-page report, interviewing Arthur Stancil about this. And Arthur Stancil was meticulous. In his background, he was a physicist, a mathematician, and had a degree in engineering. The guy was really for real. He had ultra-high class, top secret clearances. And so, but he's blown off by this guy that told this other story as like maybe Stancil drinks too much. And then he even said he didn't believe he ever had a top secret clearance. I'd like to see anybody working at a bomb blast range without one.
Yes, definitely.
It just doesn't happen. So, anyway, part of it isn't like I go in and I get a weekend's worth of training and I come out and I'm branded an investigator. It doesn't work that way in the museum field. Museum field is a science, and when we do excavations and ground tests and all of the things we do it by the book, and some things can take 20 years to do because of trying to protect the site so it's not corrupted. That's what's wrong with Roswell. I told Donald Schmidt, who I admire, and we've talked, and I told him, I felt sympathy for him and the task he's got in front of him because he has been involved in that along with Stanton Friedman, and they're dealing with a site that it's a 1 square mile area they think is a debris field that basically looks like it was carpet bombed, and it's been trod over by thousands of people for 65 years. That spoils the site.
Oh yes, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Disturbed it. Do you have any?
So I hope they found something.
Oh,
pardon.
Yeah, I hope so.
Oh, I mean, I had a question. I was going to say, at the crash site you were talking about, did you see any strange rocks or any strange, like, burn marks or anything, impact zone?
Now, which site are you talking about?
You said that there was the one that crashed, and there was the one that landed. I was saying the one that crashed into the hillside.
Red Lake?
Yeah.
Yes, the answer to that is not shown by satellite at all, because you can't get the clarity down low. But the drone, I knew. I had an aviation historian and current museum curator who is a relative and to one. He's part of the family here who are eyewitnesses. Even offered to help a small convoy of Air Force recovery people and offered to show them where the thing went down. He watched it with the family. And the Air Force said, you go back in your house and stay there and don't come out. I mean, that's what they said. And so he knew. He had been tipped off by a person I cannot name, who I'll tell you what he did, and I don't want to get him in trouble if he's still living, and I suspect he is. He became a minister, a reverend, and he formed a church so that he could counsel Area 51 workers. And the government could not interfere with what he was doing because it would violate the borders of church and state. Okay? So he was able to hear things to get him off their conscience about stuff that they were seeing at Area 51. And what he did do is pass on to the aviation historian the location name of the May 22nd crash, which was Futank, which meant Red Lake. And I got up on that butte after having already done the overfly with my consulting engineer and examining the photography of 6 cameras, and I was right. The aviation historian couldn't find anything. And there is the ricochet mark, if you want to call it that. There is a blowout. It's called a blowout, and it's where the craft clipped the top of the butte, and it plowed not very deeply. It's a completely rounded, long, federally government-owned, crab-shaped deposit of rock out in the middle of the desert floor next to Red Lake and the Hualapai Valley. And there it was. And then with the aircraft and cameras, the drone, we're able to calculate about the rate of fall, so you'd get a ricochet. It's like skipping a stone on water. And that's what caused it to shoot up over the reservoir, and it slammed into the bank. And when I was on the butte, and I'm standing right with what I'm telling you about, and I have that in Hidden Approach, the DVD that I've got on my website, and will be in the movie, much more than what I've put in Hidden in Plain Sight. But you can see where it impacted. And the Air Force, according to the recovery team member, they had just gotten the other crafts out of here. And on the day, they did it at nighttime. You get it out where nobody can see. And in the morning, in came this other thing. And they were still right there. So they had to do something about taking care of another one. And they swept the area twice, meaning above the water. They trucked everything because it rained debris, parts. And all of that stuff that went into the reservoir has been washed away in 60 monsoons. Well, 60 monsoon season, meaning more than 60 monsoons here. And if you're in Las Vegas, you understand the word monsoon the way we do. It can be really treacherous and nasty and a lot of water. But I took a small group to the actual crash site at Red Lake, and you can see the Air Force turned all the bottom rock is up on top of the sand of the desert floor where they were digging out the parts, and there is still some of the skid mark that still exists because it's higher up away from the erosion of the water and monsoon. So the answer is, oh yeah, you can really see it. I mean, really see it. And I have some archaeologists that want to be able to go down what would we call downstream the washes, and probably several miles, and we'll start looking next summer to see if we can pick up anything the Air Force has lost, because it won't be. And what they did later, the rancher that owned this, or was the one that was told to go in his house, he went and he cut a hole in the side of the dam because he no longer was going to run stock there, and that removes the liability in case the dam blows out, because you end up buying everything downstream if you have a dam fail. So he cut a big hole in it. That accelerated the amount of water being washed out of the reservoir, and the gap in the dam is 60, 80 feet wide, and I have photos of that as well. I mean, all this stuff I've got hundreds of hours of video, I've got thousands of pages of documentation, and I've narrowed it down to some kind of sensible thing where people can see it and get a kind of an overview of what's going on. There were only 2 roads, if you remember me mentioning that. There was a story that was being run on Open Minds TV at the website about some investigators saying that they had closed off Highway 40 in 1953 all the way from Kingman to Barstow, California, and for 4 days, and even some side roads, so they could move the Kingman UFO across the road. The problem with that is Highway 40 didn't exist for another 31 years.
Yeah.
It's a freeway. Come on. So, and some of it's so simple, and it's even worse than that. So the armchair, I would like to tell everybody to really, you have to look at things where you get a half-truth. You think about what you're reading as a half-truth. If there's no evidence, claims are claims, and that's all they are. And the half-truth that you're reading, it may not be the half that's the truth. So, but the importance of this old retro crash is it's the beginning of the Area 51 story. And we didn't have to create hybrids, and that's what I have right in front of me. Supposedly, the government did some experimenting from a Roswell DNA in 1947, and they created hybrids. Why would they do that? They had 6 living ETs, aliens, right from here, who went willingly. The only thing that the crew members hedged about was they did not want to be they didn't want to be split up.
Here, I don't want to interrupt you, but our show will be ending in a couple minutes, and usually at the end of each show we ask our guests to share websites, books, DVDs that they may have made, where they might be speaking, and that type of information. So feel free to do that.
Okay. All right. See me on Facebook. Harry Drew, go to see my website, and be sure to go through all the pages of the website. It is www.kingmanufocrashes.com. I may be on, I had to turn down flying to the Alchemy event for David Said that's happening in Los Angeles on the 16th. 17th and 18th, but I may be on Skype because I can arrange that because my schedule is so busy. I'm also looking at, I have an invitation for attending an event. It is called Synthesis 2012, and that's at Chichen Itza, Cancun, and that's from the 20th to the 23rd of this year in December, and I anticipate accepting that contract to do that. And I'm already booking in 2013, so it's like I hope to be at Liverpool in the International UFO and Paranormal Conference, and whether they invite me or not, and I haven't been invited yet, I will be at the International UFO Conference at Scottsdale, Arizona in late February and the 1st or 2nd day of March. I was part of the International UFO Conference when it was at Laughlin for years under the Grand Master, Bob Brown. And so those are some of the things that are coming up. I encourage everyone to attend some of these things. Please go to my webpage. Please take a look at what I'm offering you a chance to see. I will sign all DVDs sold in November and December, and it's a limited edition. There won't be any more because we're going to Terminal Approach, and there's a couple of things coming up with that I can't talk about until next year because that's how it works. They won't let you do that. So, and I have more to do, and it's about the underground bases, and I'm having some problems with that because old-timers are saying, don't go. It was attempted already years ago. 3 people had tried are dead as a result of that, and then a couple of years ago, a couple of people, locals, went to I know the basic area, and they went there, and they are still missing. So, and I'll talk about that a little bit next year and whether I'm going to do that or not, and maybe that they'll leave me alone because it's apparently the base is still occupied, but it may be military. So, yeah, interesting. And yeah, if you gentlemen get, I'm a former member of the Las Vegas UFO Hunters with that group, and its demise was rather sad, but I've been up, you know, on some things with them, and which is kind of tough to do because I'm a little ways from Las Vegas, but just keep it in mind, the Kingman UFO craft that landed on the 18th day of May 1953 in pristine, undamaged condition along with a crew that didn't have a scratch on them is the craft that is the basis of the Area 51 story. And I have found the landing site. It is on BLM land, I'll tell you that. And I have found a crash that occurred 4 days later, and that craft was basically, it didn't take a lot of special handling. It was almost like you could take it in a junk truck because it was damaged, but of course they didn't treat it that way. They were both originally put in hangars, pre-existing hangars at Groom Lake, the military base. And it was part of it is an annex to Edwards Air Force Base. And everything that happened between there and 1955 when they got money that you could see that Congress approved was taken care of down discs. So. Okay, well. How's that? Help you out?
Oh, yes. Thank you for coming on our show. We're going to be probably ending in a minute here. I'd personally like to thank all the people who listened today and thank my co-hosts for coming on today. Anything else you want to say, Jared?
Yeah, Harry, well, since we didn't get to quite talk about all the questions we had, we'll have to have you on again soon for an update.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that if it was directed to me.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, yeah, Harry, we didn't get to cover all the questions we had since the show wasn't long enough, but you'll have to schedule a longer show and have an update show.
Normally, in my presentations, it runs back at the International MUFON Symposium, they gave me 2 hours and then questions. You know, and I really abbreviated it there, but I was very flattered. They actually made some changes for me because normally MUFON requires that a speaker surrender all their information, and I would not do that, and I declined them. And so the director went back and talked to the board and came back and said, we found a way to make an exception, and they flew me there, and I made the world release. Kingman, history has no time limits, okay? The Kingman UFO crash is of equal importance with Roswell in every way because it exists.
Again, well, okay, again, like I said, thanks. Our time